Hey, what's up, guys? Hello, Football Talk here. As we get into the second half of our biggest remaining needs for each NFL team breakdown, we already discussed the NFC last week, and now we're switching conferences. Once again, I'll try to recap a little bit what every team has done this offseason, explain how I got to the position of need that I listed, and talk about their options. Timestamps for all four divisions are linked down below in the description, and so is a link to an article that I recently put out about the most improved position groups this offseason, as well as my social media handles, which you should follow if you want to keep up with everything that I post, and just some of my opinions on things that are happening around the sport. So now let's get into it. First up with the AFC North, starting with the Baltimore Ravens. This is one of the prime organizations in football in terms of always resetting the roster and fielding a competitive squad every single year. Under Ozzie Newsome and now Eric DeCosta as the GMs, they've been exceptional at finding talent in the draft and bringing in good football players for reasonable money. So there are rarely any major holes in the context of how they want to play football. Wide receiver has certainly been an area that they've ignored in recent years, even though they did invest the first round pick in Marquise Brown a couple of years ago. They heavily attacked that area this offseason with Sammy Watkins as a free agent, Rashad Bateman and Talon Wallace in the draft, while also adding some pieces at the O-line. The position they clearly lost the most at this offseason has been edge rusher / outside linebacker, where Matt Judon and Yannick Ngakoue both moved on in free agency, as the Ravens weren't willing to hand out those kind of contracts. They did manage to re-sign Tyus Bowser. He was a second-round pick for them 4 years ago, and has now earned a $5.5 million per year deal, but he's not really your go-to pass rusher necessarily, with only 10.5 sacks over the course of his rookie contract, who is an under-the-radar versatile player for this team, as he will likely start at Sam in place of Judon in 2021. Baltimore also still has 10-year veteran Pernell McPhee, who is still doing his role well in his second stint there, and 2019 third-round pick Jalen Ferguson, the NCAA career sack record holder, whose snap percentage went down last year, and he simply hasn't been able to establish himself in the league yet. Plus, they did spend their second first-round pick from the Orlando Brown trade on Penn State's Odafe Owe, who is a super talented but really unpolished player. Since Terrell Suggs in his prime, the Ravens simply haven't had that type of alpha guy off the edge, and I wouldn't expect any of these guys to get there, with Owe being the one name to at least have the physical talent for it, but he's far from it at this point. And with their defensive philosophies, in terms of sending creative blitzes and showing pressure pre-snap, they haven't really needed that guy, but some more help is needed in my opinion to make it all the way through the AFC. With how they use them, one of the Ravens' inside linebackers could easily lead this team in sacks, and 5th rounder Dalen Hayes from Notre Dame will get some action I think as well. But having somebody to consistently win his one-on-one matchups that they can create would be huge, especially looking at how much Patrick Mahomes and Josh Allen can carve up the blitz, and their teams being the biggest threats to them in that conference. Then we move on to the Cincinnati Bengals, and let's start with this. I was a much bigger fan of what the Bengals did this last offseason in terms of getting the franchise quarterback in Joe Burrow and spending a lot of money in the open market to improve their defense. While not all of those moves might have paid off, and some of them were influenced by injuries, like nose tackle DJ Reader, who I believe will be a beast for them in 2021, I saw a clear plan. This year, they basically swapped defensive end Carl Lawson for Trey Hendrickson for the same average annual salary, which I'd describe as a parallel move or maybe just better. They addressed the 500 cumulative yards from the tight end position by bringing in a former LSU teammate of Burrow in Thaddeus Moss, who was a 2020 undrafted free agent and didn't get to see an NFL field yet. And then I have no problem in theory with them going with another former teammate of the quarterback in wide receiver Jamar Chase, who was my number 3 overall prospect, over my number 2 overall prospect in Oregon offensive tackle Penei Sewell, but then to come back and use a second round pick on Clemson's Jackson Carman and sign Riley Reef to fix the O-line, I don't have a lot of faith in, especially with Burrow coming off major knee surgery. And then I believe that one big loss in free agency creates a direct hole, which was the departure of William Jackson III, and with that the lack of a number 1 cornerback. The Bengals brought in Trey Waynes and Mackenzie Alexander from Minnesota last offseason to build a corner trio with Jackson as the key piece, but Waynes missed the whole season with a torn pec, and Alexander certainly had a subpar year, which is why he's already back with the Vikings. Waynes is looking to make his debut in Cincinnati this season, And the Bengals made 2 more additions to the cornerback room with Jadobi Awuzie from Dallas and Mike Hilton from the division rival Steelers. Hilton is definitely one of the top 3 nickels in the league in my book, and Awuzie has put together some good ball production in his career until missing half of last season. He's a number 2 for me, however, and so is Waynes. The Bengals asked the boundary corner to play a lot of man coverage, which none of those guys on the roster were ever put in that type of role, outside of Waynes being thrown into the fire at the very start of his career as I can recall, which did not go too well. Even if they want to take pressure off their position and play more zone, they still want to use the range of safety Jesse Bates as a center fielder, and that results in a lot of one-on-ones on the outside ultimately. So while the AFC North may not have had those elite X-receivers emerge, even though the talent is there now, I think Waynes will be the one to face a lot of tough challenges. Then we move on to the Cleveland Browns, where Andrew Berry and those guys in Cleveland have put together one of the most complete rosters in the whole league. In terms of the starting lineups, there's not a singular spot where I could say they clearly need an upgrade. They arguably have the best offensive line in the NFL. They certainly have the top running back duo. If Odell Beckham Jr. is back to full health, they have the weapons to punish defenses focusing too much on the run game. The defensive line goes 7 or 8 men deep. They address the biggest area of weakness on the second level of the defense with Anthony Walker from Indianapolis and second round steal Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah from Notre Dame, as well as improving the secondary with free agent safety John Johnson and nickelback Troy Hill, both formerly of the Rams, and the first round back corner in Greg Newsome II from Northwestern. Now the question becomes depth and their ability to overcome injuries to their key players. And as I look through the roster, there's not much to complain about there either, at least going off my college evaluations at some areas. If there's a position that surprisingly is top heavy, so to speak, however, it is offensive guard, where they have 2 all-pro players in the starting lineup with Joel Bitonio and Wyatt Teller, but they don't have much behind those guys. I love the 5th round pick Nick Harris coming out of Washington last year, but he I believe is a center-only prospect, where at least he doesn't give you that power as a drive blocker. At those guard spots, it's likely between Michael Dunn, who played 1 singular snap on offense last season, Drew Forbes, who didn't play any, and then Chris Hubbard probably, who had a tough time sticking on an NFL roster early in his career before getting some starting action and relief duty at right tackle for the Steelers, and then receiving a contract by the Browns to start at that spot, but was turned into a backup/swing tackle again when the Browns addressed the position with the top free agent addition and draft pick a year later. Hubbard did see some action at right guard last season, filling in for an injured Teller, and he played alright, although that should be the case for most guys, lining up between 2 Pro Bowlers. So I'm not saying this would derail the Browns season or anything like that, but this would be the one position where I wouldn't feel great about what they'd put out there if injuries were to hit them. Especially if Hubbard had to fill in at either tackle spot, and now they might be looking to get 4th round pick James Hudson from Cincinnati on the field, who is primarily an offensive tackle prospect and still needs plenty of work technically, as much as I like the athletic tools. And finally, the Pittsburgh Steelers. I was pretty torn on this one because the Steelers lost a lot of pieces this offseason, and I don't think it's been talked about enough. Center Marquise Pouncey will be missed more for his leadership and smarts, since he had been overrated as a player for a few years now. But Pittsburgh also let the 2 starting tackles from last season walk. Alex Highsmith will have to carry over some of the success that he had in limited action, filling the shoes of Bud Dupree. One of the top tier nickelbacks in Mike Hilton is now in Cincinnati, as I just discussed, and their other outside corner Steven Nelson is still in the open market as I'm recording this. So there were plenty of options to choose from, and for me it came down to cornerback or right tackle. At those tackle spots, it's probably between 2018 third round pick Chukwuma Okorafor, who I actually thought had a lot of talent coming out of college, Zach Banner, who is now on his 3rd short-lived contract in Pittsburgh and was the starter in week 1 last year, but was knocked out for the year with a torn ACL, and this year's 4th round pick Dan Moore Jr. from Texas A&M, who to me looks like a quality backup himself. However, with Chuck's probably just filling in at left tackle being the one major change to last year's unit, I wouldn't say that they are screwed, because I was a believer in the talent, even though he hasn't been able to get onto the field. Instead, I'm looking at this cornerback situation, where Joe Hayden is still playing solid football, but benefits from Pittsburgh's zone-heavy system, hiding some of the physical decline that there certainly is. Cam Sutton, as the best returning piece outside of that, having his more success in the slot, where I expect him to replace Mike Hilton, and then a bunch of guys who simply haven't played. Their two best additions in the secondary may be a pair of undrafted free agents in Shakur Brown from Michigan State, who I could see step into that nickel spot due to his feisty style of play, but he certainly lacks anything that excites you physically or measurement-wise, and Mark Gilbert from Duke, who looked like an emerging superstar as a sophomore, but then played in just 4 games over his last 3 years combined, and I have no idea where he is health-wise. So now you're looking at names like Arthur Mollett, James Pierre, who is actually a really good special teams player for them, but didn't even reach 30 snaps on defense last season, and Steven Denmark being in the competition for that second corner spot. So unless Brown emerges on the inside for them, and they put Sutton on the perimeter, their third-round pick from 2 years ago in Justin Lane is clearly the most logical option. He has an intriguing skill set with the length and athletic traits, but he has not been able to convince the coaching staff up to this point, with no snaps on defense as a rookie, and just 11% of them last season. So they're probably betting on him to really step up in year 3. That takes us to the second division here with the AFC East, starting with the Buffalo Bills. And since we're just at it, let's keep the theme of cornerbacks going, because looking at this Bills roster, they have a deep room of receivers. With their style of play, they don't really need anything special out of the backfield necessarily. The O-line was close to elite in pass protection last season, and then defensively, being able to bring back linebacker Matt Milano was huge, with the team construction clearly indicating that they value pass rush over coverage, with 4 picks in the top 2 rounds being used on the defensive line these last 3 years combined. They did give Trey White a big contract last offseason as a playmaking cornerback for them. They have a very versatile duo of safeties, and Teron Johnson at nickel made some huge plays for his team last year. Where they have been vulnerable, and what they really haven't addressed yet, outside of a washed-up Josh Norman in 2020, is that second cornerback spot on the outside. Levi Wallace has done for his team what he has done his entire life, and that is overachieve. As he worked his way up from a walk-on to a start at Alabama, among all those five-star recruits, and then he began his NFL career as an undrafted free agent, but has started for the Bills these last 2.5 years. However, he has not been anything more than average as a starter in the league, and I thought there was a chance to upgrade at that CB2 spot with their first-round pick, rather than going for Miami defensive lineman Gregory Rousseau. Buffalo also has Dane Jackson on the roster, who I really liked as an addition in the 7th round of the 2020 draft, with the ability to read the quarterback's body language and zone coverage, and how he gets involved in the run game, but there are some physical limitations with him, and he's not great with his back to the ball. After that, you're looking at this year's 6th-round pick Rashard Walkus from Wisconsin, who has good burst to attack forwards and is competitive at the catch point, but his hands-on approach can lead to some flags, and he comes in too hard as a tackler at this point. And then there's UDFA Elijah Griffin from USC, who has a good physical profile for a pressman corner, and therefore isn't the most natural fit for the scheme that uses a lot of zone, but he should still show some signs for them. As you can tell, none of these options are super exciting to me, and that's why I disagree a little bit with the approach that Brandon Beane and Sean McDermott have taken, because the main target at hand should be how they can beat the Chiefs, which, looking at the last meeting in the AFC title game, the quick passing and RPO game were almost unstoppable, where those guys up front can't really affect the game the way that the secondary would be able to. Next up, the Miami Dolphins, and Dolphins fans have a sour taste in their mouth for how last season ended, putting together their worst performance of the year in that Week 17 must-have matchup against the division rival Bills, who actually sat plenty of starters in the second half. However, let's not forget that this team won 10 games and has only gotten better. They certainly needed more explosiveness and speed on offense, which is why they brought in Will Fuller, coming off a career year in Houston until he was suspended for PEDs late, and they used their 6th overall pick in the draft to reunite Tua Tagovailoa with former Alabama receiver Jalen Waddle, who to me was the most dynamic player with the ball in his hands in college football these last couple of years. Head coach Brian Flores is one of the premier defensive minds in football and really created issues last season for offenses with all the different variations of pressure packages, but I thought they needed at least one guy who can consistently win his one-on-one matchups as a pass rusher, which is what I believe they got in their 2nd first-round pick Jalen Phillips from Miami, who will replace Shaq Lawson, who they traded away for Bernard McKinney from Houston, and himself will step in for Calvin Noy, who they decided to cut somewhat surprisingly after signing him to a big deal last offseason. You add on top of that some of the additions that they made to an already very strong secondary, and making this probably a 4 at backfield offensively, and there really aren't many holes to point at, as long as that young offensive line can come together. So instead I'm looking to optimize special teams, where they have a couple of guys now that can really scare people in the return game, and one of the top kickers in the league, but punter is still a bit of a question mark in my opinion. The Dolphins decided to let Matt Haag walk, who was in the bottom half in average and net average yards per, but more importantly saw 2 of his punts return for touchdowns. Not saying that this was all his fault in any way, but them not resigning him does tell us something. Now they've replaced him with Michael Pollardi, who had a couple of good years in Carolina after taking some time to establish himself on an active roster before missing all of last season with an ACL injury. Looking at Pollardi's career numbers, punt returners have put up 8.6 yards per return against him, so to speak, which in 2020 only 8 guys with at least 20 attempts averaged more than, and in 2019 3 of his kicks were taken to the house. So below average would be my expectation for this upcoming season, and for a team with an elite defense potentially, which struggled to move the ball themselves with 2 under center as a rookie, field position advantages will be key. That brings us to the New England Patriots, and this is going to be a very interesting season for the Patriots, because for the first time since the year 2000, they're coming off a season with a negative record, in that first year without Tom Brady in the center. I haven't forgotten that they were one Cam Newton goal line run stop away from starting the season 3-0 before he caught COVID and never looked the same. And getting Dante Hightower back from his opt-out is big as well, as the heart of that defense. But I also understand that they absolutely had to go out of their way in terms of spending resources to get back to being a player in the AFC. Most importantly, they needed more skill position talent, which they addressed with 2 underrated wide receivers, I would say, in Nelson Aguilar and Kendrick Bourne, as well as the top 2 tight ends on the market in Jonnu Smith and Hunter Henry. So I'd expect to see a lot of 12 personnel and just more versatility from that offense in 2021. But while Josh McDaniels in his modification of an Erhard Perkins-based offense doesn't make much of those classic wide receiver tags, I don't think the Patriots have that X type of receiver in terms of a big body guy who can win on the outside. So you could also just call this size receiver, since many teams don't look for that type of skill set with the single receiver in trips anymore, opting for more of a shifty option who can win quickly. I'm sure they will use Hunter Henry in that capacity to some degree, but the true wide receivers in that mold aren't on that roster. Their first round pick from 2 years ago, N'Keal Harry, would be the obvious choice in terms of the skill set you're looking for, but he has been highly disappointing since coming to New England, simply not showing the ability to separate against NFL cornerbacks or threaten defenses in any dimension. Nelson Aguilar might have started a new phase of his career by being used more on the perimeter in Las Vegas, but he would be more your Z in a classic West Coast offense, and Bourne did fill that X role for Kyle Shanahan when called upon in San Francisco, who will move the chains for this team, but he doesn't offer them much over the top or as a red zone option. 7th rounder Trey Nixon brings more of a vertical presence if he can establish himself on special teams, and Marvin Hall makes a few nice plays every year after he struggled to stick on the roster early on in his career. But this group is somewhat limited in my opinion and doesn't feature a wideout with size. With such a matchup-oriented approach on offense, and Cam having a fondness for those guys he can throw it up high for, it would make plenty of sense to bring in a guy like that. And finally, the New York Jets. When you pick 2nd overall, there of course are areas on your team that you need to address, and I wouldn't say that they'll be as far along as the Jaguars, for example, who were first to secure their quarterback of the future, but there are definitely things to get excited about with the Jets team, and you can see a pretty clear vision from GM Joe Douglas and that new coaching staff, building the team through the trenches and putting together a base of young players who will grow together. They did certainly address the needed wide receiver, with free agent Corey Davis coming over from Tennessee and 2nd round pick Elijah Moore from Ole Miss, who has exploded in minicamp already according to everything that you hear coming out of New York. The other big one was cornerback, where you can still argue that they have the worst position group in the entire league, so it was very hard for me to not go with that unit again, but I was a big believer in Bryce Hall, who was a 5th round pick for the Jets last year and could become a plus starter for this group, I believe. I like a couple of guys that they got in the draft, and they clearly aren't looking to invest too much into that position, as they'll be looking to run an adapted version of that cover-free Seattle system under Robert Saleh, even though he did show more diversity last season in San Francisco, but I don't believe he has the pieces to be this year. What we do know is that you need a ferocious front four to make that defense work, and I don't think people realize what Gang Green has on the interior with Quinnen Williams turning himself into a superstar, John Franklin Myers emerging as one of the premier inside rushers, and now Sheldon Rankins coming over in free agency. Carl Lawson can be your Leo-type weak-side defensive end, as he has been one of the most underappreciated edge rushers in the league these last couple of years, but I don't think the Jets have the guy on the opposite end who can line up over tight ends and control the point of attack in the run game. I wouldn't rule out them sliding one of those interior guys out there, but in terms of true defensive ends, it's up to Kyle Phillips, with just 1.5 sacks and very little production outside of that, over his 700 career snaps in New York, Ronald Blair, who Saleh brought with him from San Francisco, but his numbers benefited from getting playing time on one of the top defensive lines in the league, and Bryce Huff, who I said could have a role for the squad as an undrafted free agent last year, but not in a starting capacity. The guy with the strongest case would be Vinny Curry, a 10th-year veteran with all but one of those seasons with the Eagles, but even there, he only started the majority of games 1 year as more of a rotational piece and pass rush specialist, so I believe they have more issues on the perimeter, but the one singular spot that just isn't settled to me, which affects the rest of that whole unit, is that second defensive end, primarily lining up on the strong side. We're moving on to the AFC South, starting with the Houston Texans. So the Texans obviously have a lot of issues to deal with, looking at the whole Deshaun Watson situation, overhauling most of the staff, even though the mystery figure Jack Easterby is still there, the roster being in flux, and the whole vibe around the organization. There's no easy solution to get this ship headed into the right direction again, and I expect the current coaching regime at least to be scapegoats in this situation, as they will be in the running for the number 1 pick next April, which would finally belong to them again. In terms of the players that they do have there, the departure of DeAndre Hopkins is still lingering, and they will need several young guys to step up around Brandon Cooks at wide receiver, but at least they have the bodies there. They could have 4 different running backs start at some point this season, even though 3 of them are more in the twilight of their careers, and the offensive line at least shouldn't be atrocious as it has been in the past. I'm much more worried about the defense, which lost J.J. Watt, even though he was more valuable as a voice in the locker room, rather than the 3-time Defensive Player of the Year difference maker that we've seen in the past. They swapped linebacker Bernard McKinney for Shaq Lawson from Miami to give some help up front, and they actually got nickelback Desmond King on a bargain deal. However, that's not super exciting for a team that finished in the bottom 6 in yards and points allowed, as well as dead last in takeaways, and I don't really know what to make of the hiring of Lovie Smith as defensive coordinator, who is known for the Tampa 2 system that he brought over to Chicago from his time with Tony Dungy in Tampa Bay, and while I thought I did see a little more single high looks from Illinois last season, his comments since coming back into the league have been confusing to me, saying they weren't able to install the full defense because they didn't have the right personnel, and how they were forced to play base because of all the free wide receiver sets, all this kind of crap. Well, in the end, the Illinois defense allowed 35 points per game during Smith's tenure there, until he got fired this offseason, and while he may have Zach Cunningham as his Mike backer to sink deep if he wants to stick with this cover 2 heavy approach, which in its classic variation doesn't really work in the league anymore, especially when you don't have the guys to get to the quarterback in time for voids to not open up in the zones, the secondary lacks reliable pieces outside of Bradley Roby and Justin Reed. That second outside corner spot will be heavily contested and needing of somebody to step up, but even more so, I don't really see who will have success as that other safety, which would be more of your field side type of guy probably, and hopefully they can rotate him down to some degree, with Justin Reed at his best in the deep post. Reed has the versatile skill sets to do a lot of different things, but you want to deploy him properly, and unless they think about putting King there, which once again wouldn't allow Smith to run his full defense without a good nickel, you're looking at names like Eric Murray, Terrence Brooks, and Jonathan Owens. Not much to add here. Next up is the Indianapolis Colts, and looking at the Colts, they were my early favorites to come out of this questionable division after they traded for Carson Wentz, who's looking to bounce back from a horrible 2020 season, as his former offensive coordinator Frank Reich will be focusing on rebuilding his mechanics and getting him out of this hero ball mode. But I'm not a huge fan of anything else they did in this offseason, especially in the draft. If Eric Fisher can get back on track and be a plus starter for them at left tackle, that will prove to be a nice value signing for a year. First round pick Kwity Paye from Michigan has the potential to become an alpha on the edge for them, but I don't think he's there yet. And 2 of my favorites from last year's draft, wide receiver Michael Pittman Jr. and safety Julian Blackmon will be looking to build on strong rookie seasons. However, the loss of Anthony Costanzo on the left end of the offensive line could prove to be huge, and I think they also lost an under-the-radar piece right in the middle of that defense. The Mike linebacker thing might have some people scratching their head now, because they look at Darius Leonard playing that spot, who is one of the most dynamic players on the second level defensively league-wide, and he does slide over to the middle on passing downs, either to sink down the seams as a blitzer or even spy at the quarterback. However, the Colts actually do play a pretty high amount of base defense still, because they like the other linebacker Bobby Okereke quite a bit on the strong side, and then they like to have Leonard at will, while it was Anthony Walker doing a lot of the dirty work of taking on blocks and filling those interior gaps to allow Leonard to flow and play more freely. Walker has moved on to Cleveland, so if they want to stick with those principles, that now leaves a void right in the middle of that unit in terms of a drop-off that they might see there. Zaire Franklin seems like the most logical option. He was drafted in the 7th round of 2018, the same year that they got Leonard very early on day 2, and he's been a backup in Indianapolis these last 3 years, while adding value as a key special teamer. As far as the other linebackers on that roster go, they bring back EJ Speed, Matthew Adams, Sky Moore, and Jordan Glasgow, who just combined for 1 snap on defense last season, and none of them is over 230 pounds. And then there's former Bengals third-round pick Malik Jefferson, who I thought had a lot of upside coming out of Texas when just trusting his instincts and coming downhill, but the game has never really slowed down for him. So I'd expect a lot more sub-packages anyway from this group, and they have one of the top nickels in the league in Kenny Moore II, but when the Titans first come up with a fullback in front of Derrick Henry and want to smash that guy in the middle, having somebody there who can force the big bruiser to redirect would be key, as the Titans have moved back into the favorites role for this division in my opinion, and those kind of guys who can deal with and deconstruct blocks at a high level aren't as easy to find anymore, with the game being played more in space and the league coveting guys with range over those more old school linebackers. That brings us to the Jacksonville Jaguars. I would have gone with a flex tight end here, but with them using a top of the 5th round pick and Ohio State's Luke Farrell, who is more your classic inline guy, and the only other player of the group whose name is known by anybody outside of Jacksonville being freaking Tim Tebow, they just clearly don't value that position. Let's look a little bit at what else the Jags did this offseason. They obviously brought in Urban Meyer to take over control largely of the whole operation, and he got one of the best quarterback prospects in the last several years in Trevor Lawrence, who together are supposed to be the saviors for this franchise, which has kind of had 2 different phases of going from AFC Championship contender to bottom feeders in their existence. They added an underrated wide receiver Marvin Jones from Detroit and heavily invested into the secondary with cornerbacks Shaq Griffin via free agency from Seattle and 2nd round pick Tyson Campbell from Georgia to go with Syracuse safety Andre Cisco, who I believe has superstar potential. I talked about it kind of throughout this past season that this roster is closer than people think, especially considering that they are on a 15-game losing streak currently, but they have a lot of good young talent there already in Duval County. Even though they may lack superstars at this point, that reflects in me not even choosing a starting position for them, despite my comments on the tight end room, whose top 3 guys are clearly known for their blocking skills rather than their receiving prowess. And no, this doesn't include Tebow. In the trenches is where they needed to upgrade to some degree, especially in terms of depth, which I think they addressed nicely on defense, and depending on how quickly 2nd round pick Walker Little from Stanford can get acclimated, he and Bam Barge was a mid-round pick for them last year, to me are backup tackles with starting potential. However, I'm not sure about the interior, where that starting 3 looks pretty solid, but there's not much after that. 2018 4th round pick Will Richardson may be looking to transition to guard, and those 2 guys I just talked about could be making that move as well, at least for a year. Tyler Shadley did an okay job filling in at center this past season, but I think the drop-off if either guard got hurt would be pretty big. Casey McDermott and Dervin Gray are rosterable type of candidates for this team, where I think they'll be in the practice squad probably, but I wouldn't feel comfortable with either one of them jumping in for any significant amount of time. So if they were to scoop up another veteran guard that is still available when I look at the names of current free agents by the way, to secure themselves at that position, I think that would be a small investment worth making to ensure that they can protect their quarterback of the future first and foremost, but this tells you the roster isn't too far away from competing. And then we have the Tennessee Titans. So I already stated that the reigning division champs in the Titans to me once again will be the favorites to win the South in 2021. thanks to how much they rebounded, so to speak, from some of the personnel losses that they had earlier this offseason with Corey Davis, Jonnu Smith, Dennis Kelly, and basically the entire starting trio of corners at the end of the year. They put together my favorite draft among the teams in that division by a fairly wide margin, with their first 2 picks being Caleb Farley, the Virginia Tech corner, and Dylan Redunes, the North Dakota State offensive tackle, both having a good chance of being immediate upgrades at their respective spots. They got edge rusher Bud Dupree in a pretty good value deal, coming off a torn ACL, and then of course they made the blockbuster deal of acquiring Julio Jones for a second round pick recently, thanks to their willingness to swallow that contract primarily. To me, the offense has the chance to be right there on the fringe of the top 5, league-wide, and they will be truly balanced, more so in a classic definition rather than what we actually see today mostly. Defensively is where they really need to step up, as they were in the bottom 3 league-wide in sacks and pressure percentage, and while they do have the play-calling savvy to force quarterbacks into mistakes with the flexibility in coverage, we still have to see how they'll come together with 4 new starters potentially in nickel packages. Anybody following me knows how high I've been on Jeffrey Simmons ever since I first saw him get on the field for Mississippi State, and he made my cover photo for young defensive players primed to break out in 2020, which he certainly came through on. But Tennessee did lose the 2 other starters on the defensive line and base, in Daquan Jones and Jack Crawford. To counter that, they brought in Denico Autry from the biggest division rival in the Colts, who can play shaded inside or outside the offensive tackle, and is a very good under-the-radar player that they stole. They also signed Michigan State nose tackle Naquan Jones as an undrafted free agent, who has shown some things as a run defender with the Spartans, but is inconsistent with his hands and taken on double teams still. They also still have Laryl Murchison, who they drafted out of NC State last year, and I thought made some sense as this B-gap defender / base defensive end for that defense, and I like the way that he plays with his hair on fire, but those moves won't blow anybody away. And then you're looking at names like Avery Jones, Woodrow Hamilton, and Trevon Coley. They may be in a lot of even fronts with Harold Landry and Dupree on the edges anyway, but I don't love any of the options in the A-gap, so to at least get somebody to play even a third of the snaps for them at that spot, especially when facing Indy's rushing attack, that would make some sense for me. And I think there's a few guys out there like that still. And that brings us to a final division, the AFC West, starting with the Denver Broncos. It's funny how these things can go sometimes. I didn't talk about nose tackles for any team in the NFC, and it took me until team 27, if you will, to get there. Now we get 2 in a row, and that's a good thing for these squads, as the Broncos fill a roster that I think a lot of people don't even realize how loaded it actually is. Offensively, they have invested a lot of draft picks to upgrade at every level. They boast one of the premier young pass catching groups, with the number 1 receiver Cortland Sutton coming back from injury. They just traded up in the 2nd round to pick North Carolina running back Javonte Williams to pair up with Melvin Gordon to have that 1-2 punch out of the backfield that wants to smash defenders in their way. And thanks to the emergence of Garrett Bowles at left tackle and them swapping the other 4 starters, center is really the only spot that I'm totally sold on, since Lloyd Cushenberry struggled quite a bit as a rookie. However, they also drafted Senior Bowl standard Quinn Minus in the 3rd round, who will at least add some competition, and they could move either one of their guards to the pivot potentially. Now it will be up to a quarterback to take advantage of what they have around them, either with Teddy Bridgewater as the safe option with a capped ceiling, or third-year man Drew Lock, who needs to take out some of those overly aggressive throws out of his game still, but has all the arm talent in the world. On defense, they really addressed the one position that they struggled at last season over these last couple of months, as Vic Fangio brought in his former All-Pro cornerback Kyle Fuller, and then they drafted Patrick Surtain out of Alabama in the top 10 to have those excellent scheme fits in terms of a boundary and a field side corner, also allowing them to move Bryce Callahan back into slot. Finally having Von Miller and Bradley Chubb back together off either edge will be one of the most lethal tandems. I thought they might go with a more rangy will linebacker in the draft to pair with Alexander Johnson, but I think somebody in the middle of the defensive line who can plug those A-gaps and occupy blockers would help even more. The Broncos finished last season as the 25th rushing defense, and outside of that nose tackle spot, there's not much that you can come up with that may keep them from doing better this year. Shelby Harris is quietly one of the top 15 or so interior defensive linemen and can be disruptive in all facets of the game. Draymond Jones may not be great as a run defender, but they like to use him as somebody who can move around in passing downs. But then I don't see anybody who can be a plus contributor over the center. Mike Purcell is currently slated to start at nose tackle again, I would think, but I'd rather have him as a backup as it is, and then they don't have anybody behind him that's a natural fit at that spot. Mid-round pick McTelvin Majim from a year ago intrigued me as a one-gap penetrator, but actually had his biggest struggles against double teams. Deshaun Williams is more your 4 or 5 technique as well. Shamar Stephen is more comfortable in the B-gap, and that's about it, where none of those guys should play at the nose. Which leads us to the Kansas City Chiefs, and the number one priority this offseason for Kansas City was to upgrade the offensive line after the punishment Patrick Mahomes took and how he was running for his life in the Super Bowl. They clearly addressed that group, trading a first-round pick for Orlando Brown, signing the top guard in the open market in Joe Thuney, bringing former Bears Pro Bowler Cal Long out of retirement, and grabbing what I thought was a fringe first-round center in Creed Humphrey at the end of the second. Those moves could allow us to see the best and certainly most balanced Chiefs offense that we have witnessed yet in the Patrick Mahomes era. Lose Sammy Watkins, but I think found a gem in 5th round pick Cornell Powell as their new starting X-receiver potentially. They added a downhill player on the second level of the defense in Nick Bolton as the second rounder from Missouri, and they took a gamble on a couple of first-round corners to get back on track behind the starters that they have there. Under the radar losses that the Chiefs had were defensive ends Tano Passanio and Alex Okafor, who primarily were used on the strong side, setting a physical edge in the run game and allowing Frank Clark to chase from the backside and use wider alignments to create better angles as a pass rusher. It may not be the most glamorous job, but just like Derek Nardi and some of those other guys at the shade nose tackle did for them a couple of years ago, to really tighten up the run defense, they need guys who can hold their ground on base downs to get offenses into passing situations where defensive coordinator Steve Spagnuolo can unleash those different blitz packages. KC still has Mike Dan on the roster, who has that exact type of oversized frame, and they signed another former first-round pick in Taco Charlton from Dallas last offseason, who has the type of length and power to set the edge, but has had his issues at times holding his contain, and hasn't really provided enough pressure in the pass game for the Cowboys or Dolphins to make any effort to retain him. Now that the Chiefs brought in Jaron Reed from Seattle to rotate through with Chris Jones and move him outside the tackle even more so on passing downs maybe, that interior defensive line looks loaded, but somebody on the edge has to take advantage of ball carriers being forced to bounce out wide, and even more so, they need one other guy who can threaten with his speed to get around tackles and force quarterbacks to step up into those monsters on the inside. They did spend a day 3 pick on Florida State's Joshua Kane though, who has some freakish length and could develop into a rotational player for them, but he's far from being an impact player at this point I believe. If you take out Frank Clark and Charlton, who benefited from being in Miami in 2019, where the defensive ends get a lot of cheap sacks off those zero blitzes, the rest of those edge rushers on the roster, even right now, without full roster cuts, have combined just for 3.5 sacks in their careers. That's weird for a conference frontrunner. As far as the Las Vegas Raiders go, they've had a very odd offseason I thought. They made one of their 2 big signings to go along with Yannick Ngakoue, running back Kenyon Drake for $11 million over 2 years, even though they already had a borderline star running back in Josh Jacobs and a couple of more than serviceable pass-catching backs. They let their leading receiver walk in free agency. They brought back safety Carl Joseph after 1 year away in Cleveland, even though I do like that deal. They got rid of the 2 best interior defensive linemen in Maurice Hurst and Malik Collins. They moved on from 3 high-quality starters on the offensive line in All-Pro center Rodney Hudson and a couple of former Pro Bowlers in guard Gabe Jackson and right tackle Trent Brown. And then they made another surprise first-round pick in Alabama offensive tackle Alex Leatherwood. I like all the safeties that they picked up in the draft, but overall I think they weakened arguably the biggest strength of the offensive line, and the defense should see the biggest improvement from a more diverse play calling under new defensive coordinator Gus Bradley, and that ability to use their guys on the back end in interchangeable fashion. The offensive line is the thing that really sticks out to me. They seem to have a lot of belief in Andre James to take over at the pivot, and should have a battle for that right guard spot, while Leatherwood is penciled in the start at right tackle after they swapped Trent Brown for him with the 17th overall selection basically. The starting 5 to me certainly took a bump, but the depth behind it looks even worse to me now, outside of center where they also brought in Nick Martin from Houston. Especially on the edges, I don't like any of the options that they have on the bench. Brandon Parker was rather surprisingly the first pick of round 3 in 2018 for the Raiders, and you probably hoped that he would develop into a starter at some point, but he was an absolute nightmare as a rookie, allowing 8.5 sacks and being called for 10 penalties in 12 starts, prompting the signing of Trent Brown, while Parker hasn't been much better when they were forced to throw him out there these last 2 years. the Raiders opted for Sam Young, was as the primary backup this past season, who has been on 6 different teams over his 10 years in the league. That should already give you a good idea of what kind of player he has been, serviceable at best, as he has averaged pretty much exactly half a sack allowed per start. If edge rushers next season going up against those 2 backups need a scouting report, I just say that Parker extends way too much outside his frame, and Young is slow-footed as heck, and those things can really be taken advantage of, also in the run game to some degree. Leatherwood has some balance issues to clean up himself, and now he doesn't have Gabe Jackson inside of him, but rather Denzel Good, so I really think that right side will have its problems, and if either offensive tackle goes down for the Raiders, Lord have mercy. And for the final team of this entire breakdown, we're looking at the LA Chargers. There's a lot of things to like about this team that stood at just 3 wins and was coming off a 45-0 humiliation to the Patriots at the start of December, before masquerading the record with 4 straight wins to end the year, as their coaching staff routinely failed in the game-managing aspect. They have a young superstar quarterback who just broke almost every single rookie passing record, with Austin Eckler coming back as one of the most underrated dual-threat backs and a talented group of young pass catchers around him. To go with that, their defense is bound to make a big jump, finally having Joey Bosa and Derwin James on the field at the same time, and more help from the scheme that Brandon Staley is bringing in, which we already saw create a lot of issues for opponents for the other LA team last year, with not giving away what they're doing pre-snap. The biggest improvement in my mind, however, came on the offensive line, signing what I believe is the best center in all of football in Corey Linsley, having Northwestern standout offensive tackle Rashawn Slater fall to them at 13th overall in the draft, and signing Matt Fowler to a reasonable deal to play one of those 2 guard spots. The latter transitioned from right tackle to the inside last season and played pretty well. However, as much as that unit was upgraded, they still shouldn't be satisfied with what they have at the 2nd guard spot, between Ode Abushi, Scott Quessenberry, and maybe even rookie Brandon Kaimis, who put together some pretty consistent tape and ended up as my offensive tackle 15 in the draft. Abushi was an average starter in Detroit last season, who the Lions decided to not bring back, despite not being totally solid at one of the guard spots themselves. Quessenberry jumped in at center in 2019 and played fairly well, and Kaimis I was very impressed with actually when I got to him late in the draft process, thanks to how technically sound he was and how good he was with his angles and aiming points, but some expected him to transition to the interior due to not cracking that 33-inch arm length benchmark for tackles. No doubt that this front 5 was upgraded in a major way, but if there was one guy who could get in trouble when matched up one-on-one against Chris Jones or Shelby Harris in that division, it would be whoever they decide to start at left guard, with Abushi being the most likely candidate. I also wouldn't mind seeing them make a switch a punter. Of course those things are the whole punt coverage team, but Ty Long had the most punt return yards against league-wide, with 3 block kicks being the most in the league as well, while he had the 2nd fewest amount of fair catches and punts inside the opposing 20. And that's gonna do it. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, share it with a couple of friends who are already hungry for the NFL to come back. The video for the NFC should pop up here any second now. And like I said, if you want to read up on my piece on the most improved position groups this offseason, the link for that is down below in the description. To go with my social media outlets, if you want to stay up to date with my work and get in touch with me. I will be back next week. Not totally sure what I'll do first, either talking about the teams most likely to go from worst to first inside the division, or start my 2-part series of the 2nd and 3rd year players bound to break out. Let me know in the comments maybe what you'd like to see first. So until then, see you later. Peace!